Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Thanks so much for joining me. What I wanted to do in this video is give a quick overview of the functional range conditioning system as it relates to mobility and hopefully give you a little bit of understanding as to why we do what we do. Functional range conditioning is a model of mobility that is based on strength first and foremost, and having that understanding that lack of mobility comes from lack of strength. Those of you who've worked with me on this stuff already or have done it with anybody else already understand that this is not a passive system. I often have people when they start with me, we have to set expectations a little bit that they will in fact be working very hard to improve their mobility, even though they're not really moving, we're not using weights. It's a little bit jarring for people sometimes, but it's a really effective way to improve mobility and at the same time improve strength. Those two things do go hand in hand. So if you were to come to me to work on mobility using functional range protocols, basically what we would do is we start with an assessment. We have to understand where is the biggest deficiency lie. If I can understand where your biggest deficiency is, I can direct energy right to where you need it instead of throwing a bunch of stuff against the wall and seeing what sticks. Once we have done our assessment, and we understand where you are moving well and where you need some work, we then start to try to elicit some change. We do that through a couple of different steps. One of the first things I teach my clients is what's called controlled articular rotations, or CARs. CARs are essentially joint circles, but they really are so much more than that. CARs are a great assessment tool. I teach my people to do these CARs at least once a day. You can do them for every joint. I have other videos on my channel here that pertain to a morning routine or individual joint CARs. And they're a really good way to check in with your body daily and to get a sense of how am I moving today? How are my shoulders doing? How are my hips doing? How are my ankles doing? That's a really important thing to do, especially if you're getting ready to go be active, to have an understanding of what each part of your body is doing today. What we probably know intuitively is that we don't move the same every day. We slept weird last night. We had some stress in our life. Maybe we picked up a little injury here or there. So it's really helpful to be able to check in daily with your body. And it's actually a really important part of movement hygiene. CARs are also really effective for setting a baseline of movement. Our body is amazing in how it can adapt to both positive and negative stimuluses. Positive stimuluses would be something like exercise, strength training, cardiovascular training. Those things are going to challenge our bodies and hopefully do it in such a way that we are able to adapt over time. Our body also will adapt to negative inputs, not moving, not exercising, not eating properly. This is generally how the loss of mobility over time comes to be. As we age, we stop moving like we did when we were younger, and then we are able to move less or not move as well because we're not moving as much. So, if we can start to give the body some inputs that are going to systematically and progressively help it move more, that's going to be really beneficial to us. And that is where CARs come in, is they set that baseline level. They're saying that today, this is how my shoulder moves. And so tomorrow, hopefully it'll move about the same because I'm going to keep moving it through this range. CARs are step number one. Step number two is we get into the actual process of improving the range of motion in any given joint. And there's a couple of steps we have to do that. The first thing is going to be our passive stretching. Now, most people out there are probably familiar with the idea of passive stretching. I get into a position and I just allow the muscle to stretch. There's a couple things that I go over with my people that really helps to optimize the idea of passive stretching. And the first one is really just the idea of the stretch. We've got to be able to identify the tissue that we are trying to elicit some change in, and we've got to be able to work with that tissue so that it actually will become more mobile, become more flexible. First thing we do to do that is we can utilize this idea of passivity. as we get into a position to stretch, if I am pushing deep enough into a stretch that it is causing my brain and causing me to have a reaction of fighting, it's too much, it's maybe a little bit painful, and I instinctively tighten up and I brace against this stretch. That's the first step we have to address to be able to say, what does a passive stretch look like? What does it feel like? Once we've understood where that stretch is going to be and how do we get to what we would call an in-range position where we are stretching the tissue, but not so much that we are causing this instinctive reaction, we then can utilize our breath to help encourage this down regulation, going from a sympathetic fight or flight brain to a parasympathetic rest and relax brain. That's a really important thing to happen. And our brain, the reality of this stuff is you can't force it. It's not enough to just beat up on the tissue and say, you're going to change because I tell you to change. We've got to understand the physiology of what happens when we go to do some of these stretching positions and how can we encourage it. And breath is a great way to do that. The next thing we talk about is the idea of time. When we get into any passive stretch situation, we want to make sure that we are allowing enough time for the tissue to actually start to relax and release. That time is at least 2 minutes. In that 2 minutes, we again want to think about our breathing and try to be doing breathing that's going to encourage this rest and relaxation state of mind. And that's going to communicate to our brain that we are not, in fact, in a fight or flight mode, but we can go ahead and relax and we can start to elicit some change in the joint or in the tissue. Again, we do that with our passive breathing. I teach my people for a double exhale to inhale. So 3 seconds in, 6 seconds out, 4 seconds in, 8 seconds out, 5, 10, 6, 12. You can play around with the time there. And as you get better at this and you get more comfortable, you can definitely increase the time of the inhale and the exhale. I also encourage people that if the counting, if the numbers get to be too much, just have a nice, slow, calm exhale as you're doing this. I like to challenge my people when they start working on this to really try to block things out, treat this as an active meditation time, to breathe and to tune into the tissue. This mind-body connection is a really important aspect of all of this training. And the better you can be at tuning into your body and identifying sensations, the more successful you will be across the board, not just with mobility work. Once we have established this passive stretch pattern, once we've been in the position 2 minutes, we've used our breath to actively downregulate, and we have gained a little bit of length in the tissue and we've tuned in a little bit, then we go to get active. And again, this is where it starts to get pretty intense. There's a couple of concepts we use that as we start to try to increase our active tissue. One of the first ones that I talk to my people about is a concept called irradiation. So what irradiation is essentially the ability for your body to create tension. The concept physiologically is that any muscle is going to be made stronger, or any contraction will be made stronger if the surrounding muscles are also contracting. And so to give an example, something like a bicep, if I were to just curl my arm, if I were to bend my arm, but I'm not creating a tight hand, I'm not tensing up my forearm, I'm not tensing my shoulder, I'm only going to be able to have so much strength in that contraction. As soon as I start to bring surrounding tissue into this contraction through the use of a clenched fist, which is going to tighten up my forearm, through the use of tightening up my lats and some of these muscles up under my shoulder, tightening my belly, if I was standing, squeezing my butt, that quality of that contraction is going to go up. This is where really the idea of intensity, I think, starts to take hold. That as you start to work on some of these isometric contractions, you'll find that you get to a point of, I don't think I can do anymore. I don't know how to contract this. If you can simply irradiate more by tightening your belly, squeezing your hand more, tightening up the shoulder, it depends on where we're working, you'll find that the ability to contract goes up. So radiation is one of the first things we talk about, and on the tail end of that is intensity. That leads us into the next phase of this work, which is going to be our PAILS and rails. PAILS is going to be a progressive angular isometric loading. Rails is regressive angular isometric loading. What that means is, as we go into a joint to try to increase the range of motion, what should be limiting that range of motion is going to be tension of the tissue. Unless there's something going on with the joint, some hard tissue situation going on, what limits our mobility is tension in the muscle. And so as we are trying to increase a motion, there's going to be a couple of sides to that motion. So again, we'll use the elbow as an example. As I straighten my elbow out, there is going to be tissue that is being stretched, and there's going to be tissue that is being shortened. The tissue that is being stretched, in this case, my bicep, is going to be the progressive tissue. The tissue that is being shortened, in this case, my tricep, is going to be the regressive tissue. So when we talk about PAILS and rails, what we're talking about is PAILS pertains to the bicep in this situation, rails pertains to the tricep. What our PAILS is going to be is an isometric contraction. Isometric means that there is not any change in the length of the muscle. And so what that would look like is, in the situation of I'm trying to improve elbow mobility, my PAILS would be tensing up my bicep, essentially trying to bend my arm, but having there be some sort of a block, whether it be a strap. If I'm working with my clients sometimes, especially when we first start out, I will be putting my hands on them to help them feel where they need to be feeling the contraction and things like intensity. But in this situation, I'm going to be blocking my forearm. So as I try to bend my elbow, I'm not allowing it to bend. That's what the isometric contraction is all about. And so I'm going to try to bend. Every second we hold for about 10 seconds, I'm going to be increasing the contraction. I will tell my people, think about, you've got a volume knob on a radio, and every second you're just slowly turning that volume knob up to about 8 out of 10. 80% is what we look for. And so you don't want to go 0 to 60, ready, go as hard as you can. And you want to try to avoid jerky motion. The whole point of this stuff is improving control. So try to avoid the 1, 2, 3. Think about slowly over the 10 seconds. I am increasing the quality and the intensity of that contraction. That is our PAILS contraction. Progressive angular isometric loading. The rails is going to be the regressive angular isometric loading. So once I've done my PAILS, push, 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 relax. Now I'm going to fire the regressive tissue rails, and I'm going to try to actively increase the range of motion. In this case, with my elbow, I'm just trying to get a little bit more motion extension-wise out of the elbow. Hold that for about 10 seconds. Repeat 2 to 3 times. It depends on how hard we are able to go. We're really looking for some max effort with this stuff. I usually, with my people, will do about 2 to 3 reps to try to increase the range. The PAILS and rails is where we actually start to increase the range of motion. And it's a really satisfying process, because you'll start within about 5 minutes from start to finish, you're going to find that the motion has improved in that joint. The beauty of the system with FRC, excuse me, is that we are also, while improving the range, we are simultaneously improving the strength. Lack of mobility will correspond always to lack in strength. So the way that we improve mobility is we improve strength. That is done primarily out of the gate by PAILS and rails. Once we've done a couple rounds of PAILS and rails to increase the range of motion, now we're going to be trying to improve the strength at in range. Physiologically, the way it works with our muscles is we are going to be weakest at the in range of our motion. And so when we talk about minimum effective dose, we're talking about trying to be systematic about getting to the weakness. That's a great way to go about it, is we get to in range and we start to strengthen. So what that means with something like this is that as I have increased the range of motion in my elbow, what I then will do is I'm going to go into what's called a passive range hold. So I've improved how how much I can straighten my arm. Then I'm going to remove the block. So in this case, as I am pulling down, that's a passive range of motion. I'm not actively taking my arm there. I'm using my other hand or maybe a weight or a strap to open that elbow joint up. I'm really straightening out my arm. Now, when we get to passive range holds, what we're going to be doing is we are going to be removing this support and trying to not let our arm rebound. And so, no, of course, in order to do that, we have to be really working on the backside to keep this arm nice and straight. We do that for a couple of rounds, 10-second holds, 2 to 3 times. And then we go into in-range liftoffs. We want to take ourselves to that in-range, and then we're going to try to actively take ourselves a bit further. So with something like the elbow, that might look like this. If I'm supported here in my upper arm, I'm going to get that arm straight, and then I want to try to actively now straighten that arm even a little bit more, utilizing things like my tricep to bring some, to actually initiate contraction in that in range. And then the last thing we use with the mobility component is going to be what's called hovers. And what hovers are is my ability to straighten my, in this case, my arm through a range of motion. And so sometimes with this, we can set up obstacles to give you kind of a visual cue, or we can just use just some verbal cueing as far as how we want to do this. I'm using the elbow as an example. This is the same process no matter the joint that we are working. So if it's shoulders, hips, spine, ankle, knee, the process is the same. It's just, of course, the setups that will change. This is probably a good time to mention that this system is not based on the exercises themselves, but based on the stimulus and the response. So what I always encourage my people is don't get too caught up in how we're doing what we're doing, not in the exercise, but in the response. You have any given, I mean, you can explore setups, every day a different setup. And in fact, there's a lot of really talented FRC practitioners out there who come up with some great setups to work on hip internal rotation or shoulder flexion or knee dorsiflexion, or I'm sorry, ankle dorsiflexion. That is all only limited by our creativity. The stimulus and the response is what we're really after with this stuff. I'll have more videos on my channel that explore different setups for different positions. And so feel free to check those out there. But that's hopefully going to give you a pretty brief crash course overview on the system here, the FRC mobility system. So if you have any questions, please hit them up in the comments below. You can reach out to me here or on any of my social medias. I'm Fry Wellness pretty much across the board. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you guys soon.